Hey there nation, and welcome to the show where we help you to play miniatures wargaming on a budget. It is I, Commander Cheapskate, and welcome to Cheap Shots, the ultimate series for miniature wargamers who want stunning tabletop quality miniatures without breaking the bank. In this series, we'll show you how to save money on your miniatures painting hobby by using affordable craft paints, budget-friendly tools, and clever techniques. Whether you're a beginner or a seasoned hobbyist, we'll learn how to achieve incredible tabletop results without the premium price tag. And on today's video, we're going to show you guys how to paint up Skittershank's Clawpack, a Skaven warband for your games of Warhammer Underworld. And by following the tips, techniques, and materials that we suggest, we can help you save over $149.62 and exactly achieve a beautiful tabletop result at exactly the same time. So let's go and talk about the design quality real quick for these miniatures. As you can notice, the Skittershank's Clawpack is painted up quite differently than the box art. In the box art, they have a lot of browns and blacks and a lot of shadowy colors appropriate for these guys. But if you notice, I have a lot of reds, greens, as well as golds in this warband. And the reason why is because I'm not planning on using it as Skittershank's Clawpack in Warhammer Underworlds. In fact, I'm planning on combining it with another Warhammer Underworld Skaven warband called Spike Claw Swarm, which I did a video on earlier, which does have a lot of red and gold and green within its paint scheme. And the reason why is because I plan on combining these two warbands to make a Skaven warband in an upcoming Mordheim campaign. So that being said, let's go and talk about how you guys can quickly as well as cheaply paint up Skittershank's Clawpack with using cheap craft paints. Alright, so the very first thing you have to do, of course, is to assemble your miniatures as well as to prime them. Now the nice thing about these miniatures, of course, is that the bases already have texturing already on them. They have this beautiful kind of like industrial kind of wasteland kind of look on these bases. So they look absolutely fantastic, and because these miniatures are really simple to assemble because they're push fit together, putting these things together and assembling them is a real snap. It's real easily able to do it. Now the next thing you gotta do, of course, after you assemble your miniatures is to prime your miniatures. Now priming actually does a couple of things. The primary thing that primer does is that it actually allows your acrylic paints to adhere to your miniatures. If you're to take regular acrylic paints and try to apply it on your miniatures without primer, unfortunately the slightest bit of friction will cause it to rub right off your miniature and of course ruin the overall effect on it. So in order to avoid that, I recommend using primer to do so. The second thing that primer also does is that the color of primer that you use actually has a very important impact on the vibrancy of the colors that you use on your miniature. Traditionally speaking, if you want to go for a brighter or lighter paint color scheme, or a color scheme that receives a lot of bright bold colors, you want to go with a lighter primer, whereas if you want to go with a more shadowy or metallic color, you go with a black colored primer in order to do so. Now because we're going to do an oil wash on these miniatures, which is going to darken down the value of the colors that we put onto the miniatures, I like to go with a flat white primer. In this case, I use Rust-Oleum's flat white primer. You can get this at your local Walmart for about $3.99. I just do a quick once over the primer all over the entirety of the miniature, making sure I have a good even coat across it, and then from there ready to put on our very first base coat. So the very first detail we're going to work on these Skaven is on the fur, and luckily for us there's quite a bit of fur on these guys, and I decided to use 3 different colors in order to paint up these miniatures. I decided to use Pavement Paint by Apple Barrel to paint up Skittershank himself, that way he could be used as a black Skaven for my Mordheim warbands. At the same time, for his champion level fighter, I decided to pick him out 2 thin layers of Pewter Gray by Apple Barrel Paint, and for the 3 remaining fighters I decided to pin out their fur in 3 layers of Moccasin Brown by Anita's Acrylic. Now you can get the Apple Barrel paint at your local Walmart for about 50 cents, as well as the acrylic paint from Anita's Acrylic from Hobby Lobby. The Apple Barrel paint will cost you 50 cents a tube, whereas the Anita's Acrylic will cost you 65 cents at your local local Hobby Lobby as well. And I just put 2 thin layers all over all the fur that is exposed on the miniature. Now you don't need to be particularly neat at this point because you're just trying to get a good solid base coat for all the fur, so you don't need to worry about making any messes. Just make sure you have a good, decent level of color, as well as a pigment on the fur that you have, so that way you can dry brush them later on. And speaking of dry brushing, that's exactly the next step that we're going to go with. Now dry brushing is actually a really neat paint technique to use because what it does, it creates the illusion of depth in your miniatures. By dry brushing your miniatures, what ends up happening is that the lighter color pigments actually adhere to the raised surfaces of the miniature, while the darker colors that you used before for your base coat stay in the recesses of the miniature as well. So it creates this illusion of highlights as well as depth on the miniature. So in order to create that effect, I use Folk Arts Pale Gray. It's going to cost you 75 cents at your local Walmart. I use it on both the champion level miniature as well as the leader, which I painted in pavement as well as pewter gray before, to bring out a lot of those details so you can see like the individual fragments of fur on their bodies. It also brings a lot of the musculature that they have. As for the 3 miniatures that I did in Moccasin Brown, I picked out in a really thin dry brushing of Territorial Beige by Apple Barrel Paint. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 50 cents. Now, if you notice, you do have this kind of chalky pastel appearance when you do dry brush your miniatures, and that's just an overall effect of doing so. But don't worry though, when we get to the oil washing stage, that's going to actually smooth out the transitions between our dry brushing as well as our base coating. So because of that pastel kind of chalky appearance will go away. The next detail we decided to paint up are the flesh details on these miniatures. As weird as it may sound to say this, yes, Skaven do have flesh. In this case, their tails primarily, as well as some of their snouts as well. So to pick up that detail, I use Pale Flesh Color by Apple Barrel Paint. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 50 cents. I just put 2 thin layers directly onto the tails, as well as the tip of the snouts of some of the Skaven, so that way we can bring out that detail that we couldn't see before. And to add a little bit of additional highlighting, I decided to dry brush the flesh tone with Delta Serum Coats Peaches and Cream. It's a nice pale flesh color you can get your local Hobby Lobby for about 65 cents. I just do a quick dry brushing on all the material, all the parts of the miniature that I painted in flesh tone. That way you get that illusion of depth by creating those highlights in the segments of their tails. So now that we're done with the fur, the next detail we're going to work on is on the clothing. In this situation, I decided to pick out some of the clothing, like the shirt on Skittershank himself, as well as the pants for most of the other fighters. I also picked up the cloak of the chest tunic for the champion miniature that's armed with a net as well. And I decided to use Holly Branch by Apple Barrel Paint. It's a nice bright green color that you get your local Walmart for about 50 cents. And I put 2 thin layers directly onto the parts of the clothing that want to be that green color. Like I said before, I'm trying to match these guys up with Spike Claw's Swarm, which is basically another Skaven warband that I did earlier. And I used that as the basis for my Skaven warbands for the Mordheim that we use for our Mordheim battle reports. And I want these guys to be added to that warband. So because I decided to pick that out and kind of match it with the same kind of clothing colors as well as color scheme. And to create that illusion of depth as well as highlighting, I decided to dry brush the Holly Branch with a thin dry brushing of Lime Sherbet by Apple Barrel Paint. It's a nice bright green sherbet dry brushing color. It's a nice pastel color. It's beautiful for dry brushing, and I just apply it directly onto the clothing. As you can see, a lot of the things that we couldn't see earlier, like a lot of the details like the fold of the fabric, is now exposed because of that dry brushing that we've done. Continuing on with the rest of the clothing for Skittershank himself, as well as the champion who's armed with the net, I decided to paint out their trousers in 2 thin layers of Anita's acrylic Moccasin Brown. I also did exactly the same color on the little rat on the netter's base. You can see right there right next to him. Picked out 2 thin layers, so that way it kind of contrasts nicely with the green that they're wearing, as well as the brown. So that way it kind of adds a little bit of more visual appeal to these miniatures. The main color we're going to use for the clothing, however, is Anita's Acrylic True Red. Red is a prominent color that's in Spike Claw's Swarm, which is the warband I painted up earlier. And since I want these fighters to match with that warband, I decided to use exactly the same color for most of the clothing on these miniatures. Primarily on their cloaks is the main thing I was focusing on. So as you can see on Skittershank himself, I painted the palm of the little ribbons that he has on the pommels of his sword, as well as his hood, as well as his cloak. I painted the same color on the cloak on the 2 champions in the background, as well as the head wrappings, as well as the cloak on the fighters in the foreground as well. I just put 2 thin layers of this color on all the parts that I wanted to be red. And the next step, we're to add an additional layer of detail for these miniatures, as I decided to dry brush the red with Tropic Orange by Apple Barrel Paint. It's a nice pastel orange. You get this at your local Walmart for about 50 cents. And once again, I just did a quick dry brushing over all the red fabric that I painted earlier. That way we could see a lot of the details we couldn't see before, like the individual folds in the fabric, as well as the highlighting on it. So now that we're done with most of the clothing, the next thing we need to work on is on the leather goods that these characters are carrying as well. So for example, for Spike Claw himself, because he has black fur, I decided to use burnt umber in order to pick out the details for things like the scabbard of his sword and his weapons, the belts and the harnesses that he's wearing. I put 2 thin coats of that. You can do that at the local Walmart for about 50 cents. As for the champion with the net in the middle, I use Territorial Beige. I use that for the net that he's carrying, as well as for a lot of the belts, as well as body rigging he's wearing on his person. And for the 3 remaining Skaven, I decided to use pavement paint to pick out those leather details as well. So things like the sling, for example, the leather straps on the shoulders, as well as the rigging that these characters are wearing. And once we were done with that, the last thing I did, of course, I did another dry brush. This time I did it on the net that the fighter is carrying. I decided to dry brush that in some khaki by Apple Barrel paint. You can get that for about your local Walmart for about 50 cents. Just bring out those additional details so you can see the little individual segments of the net that they're carrying. At the same time, I thought that their cloaks were a little too dark for my liking, so I decided to add another layer of dry brushing on top of their cloaks and to top of that red cloak they were wearing. So I decided to dry brush that with some cameo pink by Apple Barrel. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 50 cents as well. I just did a quick dry brushing on that just to add a little bit more highlighting to their cloaks to kind of brighten them up a little bit. And of course, because most of their clothing is done, what you need to do now is some of the finer detail for their clothing. And the colors I decided to look for that is for the things like the wrappings that they're having around their arms, as well as their ankles, as well as things like their eyes, for example, as well as some of the weapons that they're carrying in addition to that. So for the eyes, I decided to pick out 2 thin layers of Mermaid Blue by Delta Serum Coat. You can get that at your local Walmart, Hobby Lobby for about 65 cents. And I put this on the eyes, specifically on all the champions that you see, as well as the fighters in the foreground. Now, Skittershank himself has a hood that's pulled over his eyes, so you really can't see his eyes. But the reason why I use that pale blue-gray blue color is because it contrasts nicely to all the browns and reds that we're using on these miniatures, and it kind of helps that detail to stick out. Now, as for the actual poison wind globes that some of these fighters are carrying, I picked out 2 thin layers of Kiwi by Apple Barrel paint. It's a nice lime green, kind of slimy yellowish color that you can get at your local Walmart. It costs about 50 cents as well. Let's put that on the poison wind globes that a lot of these fighters are also carrying, like hand grenades on their person. And the last thing I concentrated on things like the cording on the grips of the weapon, as well as the wraps around their wrists, their ankles, as well as some of the faces that these characters are wearing as well. And I used Apple Barrel's Apple Green. Apple Green costs 50 cents at your local Walmart. I just put 2 thin layers on those wrappings that contrast nicely against the fur, as well as the red details on these miniatures. And now that we're done with the clothing, the next thing we're going to focus on now is on the metallic elements. So the next detail we're going to focus on real quick is on the metallic elements on these miniatures. Primarily 2 colors we're going to be using. The first one is Emperor's Gold by Deco Art. You can get that at your local Walmart for about 75 cents. And we use this for a lot of the armor these characters are wearing. So things like shoulder guards, for example, chest plates. We picked those out in those 2 thin layers of that gold color. Same thing with the hilts of the weapons, as well as the pommels of their weapons as well. That's a nice, beautiful gold color that contrasts nicely with all the colors we're using. Same thing with like their jewelry that they're wearing. So that way it kind of blends in nicely and also kind of creates that additional detail. In addition, I also picked that color because for Spike Claw Swarm, I decided to pick up their armor elements in gold as well. So that way these guys are very similar to Spike Claw Swarm, so that way they look like they're part of the same warband. Now, as for their weapons themselves, I decided to pick out 2 thin layers of Gunmetal Gray by Folk Art. So things like the blades of the swords, as well as some daggers that they're carrying, other colors as well. So for those details, I picked those out 2 thin layers of Gunmetal Gray. You can get that at your local Walmart for about 75 cents as well. Now, if you notice, some of the weapons, like the blades that Skittershank is carrying, as well as the champions in the background, I did not paint their swords in that color. And the reason why is because I want to make it look like these guys are carrying warpstone blades, and so I decided to go forward with that. And speaking of those warpstone blades, let's talk about exactly how I did that. Now, unfortunately, when I started painting them up, I didn't really like the way they looked when I first started with the process I was trying out, so I will admit that right off the bat. I ended up changing my mind later on and decided to use a different technique to create those warpstone blades. But the nice thing about my cheapskate method of painting, because we're using such cheap materials to paint our miniatures, it's not really going to break the bank if you decide to change your mind in the middle of it. After all, the most expensive paint that we use costs 75 cents as opposed to like $7.80. So we're spending 10 times less money, so we can make mistakes like this and not really hurt ourselves too much. Now, for this particular technique, I was experimenting with using yellow as a base coat and then bringing up layers of dry brush and green on top of it to kind of give this green kind of glowing effect. It didn't really work out. I didn't like the way it looked, so I will change my mind later on. But for this picture, though, I'm going to show you exactly how I did it. So for the blades, for like the boomerang, as well as for the swords, I picked out 2 thin layers of King's Gold by Apple Barrel paint. You get to your local Walmart for about 50 cents. Now we're going to stop with that process of the warpstone blades because my idea at the time, of course, was to actually paint those after I did my oil wash, so that way it's a nice vibrant green. So I decided to deal with the bases instead. Now I decided instead of painting just like normal 2 base coats on the bases. I decided to try glazing as a technique because these bases actually have a lot of detail on them. They have things like cobblestones, they have pipes, they have grates, iron grating, all kinds of really cool details. So to make sure I don't overpower those details by wiping them out with successive layers of base coating paint, I decided to try glazing instead, and I actually glazed the bases in 3 layers of pigment paint by Apple Barrel Paint. I did a quick glazing on those bases so that way a lot of those details can still remain. Afterwards, I did a quick dry brushing with some pale gray, and I really like the way that this looks, especially on these pre-textured bases already with a lot of the sculpting on it. You can see a lot of the details that we couldn't see before, like the individual gaps of the cobblestones, the iron grating, pipes, all kinds of stuff. So I decided that was a much better method to use on the bases, that way we could see those details. And speaking of the bases, the last thing we did, of course, was to paint the metallic elements on these bases with 2 layers of gunmetal gray by Folk Art. So things like pipes, for example, iron gratings, we decided to pick up those metallic elements in that gunmetal gray color because normally that's where you make those things out. It would either be iron or made out of steel. So now that we're done, of course, the next thing we gotta do is an oil wash. And for this, we actually use Midwax Poly Shades Acrylic in Mission Oak. It's a nice, beautiful stain that also has polyurethane mixed with it as well. We just apply it like a wash all over the entirety of the miniatures for like their clothing, the miniatures themselves, as well as their bases. Now, the reason why we do this step is because we're doing an oil wash. Now, most people, when they do an oil wash, they like to use Army Painter Strong Tone in order to do that. And there's nothing wrong with Army Painter Strong Tone. It is exactly what it advertises it does, but the problem though is it costs $35 a can, whereas Midwax Poly Shades in Mission Oak color only cost $6.99 at my local Walmart, and it pretty much does exactly the same thing. And that's the reason why I like using that, because it's about 5 times cheaper than the Army Painter stuff. Now what you got to do, of course, you got to apply this like a wash all over the miniatures, and the Poly Shade does actually a couple of things. The first thing that it does is that it creeps directly into the creases of the miniatures and brings out those details that we couldn't see earlier. So things like the folds of the fabric, for example, the joints of the fighters, the gaps between the individual folds of clothing, the individual segments of the net, for example. It brings a lot of those details we couldn't see earlier. Now the second thing it also does too is it also smooths out the transitions between our dry brushing as well as our base coating. As you can see, that pastel kind of chalky appearance is now gone because it kind of blended those colors together and made it more organic. And the last thing it also does as well is it also mutes the vibrancy of our colors. As you can see, they're not as bright or vibrant as they used to be, and that's the reason why we use such bright paints in the first stages of the miniatures, because that we know that poly shade is going to darken them down quite a bit. Now you do have to wait for this stuff to dry and cure for 24 hours because it does have a polyurethane inside of it, so I recommend using this at the very last step of your painting process when you actually do this, because you got to wait 24 hours for this stuff to dry and cure. And if you try to handle it while it's still tacky, you run the risk of actually removing your paint off the miniature, and it'll absolutely ruin your finish. Alright, so let's go and talk about exactly what I did next. The next thing I decided to do, of course, is start working on the blades. And like I said before, I started off with that yellow base coat, and I decided to glaze this holly branch paint on top of that to kind of create this kind of glowing, kind of ethereal look for the warpstone blades. And I decided to kind of go with this. It's still a little too dark for my liking, but I decided I was going to see it through to see exactly how it turned out first before I decided to change my mind. And the next step, of course, is to do a glaze. This time we're actually using Skyline by Folk Art as well as Lime Sherbet by Apple Barrel Paints. Now I'm using the glazing for the Skyline on the smoke cloud that's actually on the base of the champion right in the middle of the table. And the reason why I decided to use that is because I want to make it like this is like a little smoke bomb that went off and this guy's kind of jumping through the smoke. And I want to create this kind of ethereal, kind of glowing effect with that smoke bomb effect. So I decided to use glazing in order to do that. Now if you want to know how to do glazing, it's pretty simple. All you do is you do a 50-50 mixture of your paint as well as water, so that way water is down more as like a wash, and what you do is you just kind of paint on like watercolors and let it dry and add less successful layers later on. Now the reason why you do this is because what it does, it allows the white undercoating to kind of bleed through the layers and kind of creates this kind of glowing ethereal look. The only problem with glazing is that it is quite boring and it takes a lot of steps to do it. It takes a while for this stuff to dry and then apply another layer. You have to wait for it to dry again, but it creates the ethereal look that you're looking for your miniatures. And I decided to do exactly the same thing with Lime Sherbet directly onto the blades of the warpstone blades I wanted to have done, and I put 3 layers on that as well. However, as I was looking at though, it didn't look quite right to me. It wasn't as bright as I wanted it to be, and I decided to change my mind after my next step. So the next step in order to create that ethereal look is you just do a quick dry brushing. For the smoke plume that's in the middle of the fighter, I decided to dry brush that smoke plume with Dutch Aqua by Folk Art. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 75 cents. It does a beautiful job making it look smoky and iridescent and kind of creepy looking. And I also dry brushed the Warpstone blades with Canary Yellow by Apple Barrel Paint as well. And after I got done dry brushing it, it didn't look right. I didn't like the way that it looked, and I realized that I might have made a mistake by using this method to create my Warpstone blades. So I decided to change my process later on. I'll show exactly how I did that here in a second. I decided to go back to my original plan, which is of course just to glaze the miniatures. And that's exactly what I do in this photo. For the smoke plume that I have in the middle, I decided to glaze it with some bright blue by Apple Barrel Paint, apply it like a wash, add 3 layers directly onto it. And as you can see, it's like this nice kind of dark, shadowy, kind of ethereal pluming color for that smoke column. I thought looked really cool as well. As for the Warpstone blades I did earlier, I decided to put 3 layers of glazing with the crisp apple color by Apple Barrel Paint, and I applied that on there, and I was much happier with the end result. It has like this kind of glowing kind of green effect going on with the Warpstone blades. I was much more satisfied with that look than I had the previous one that I had over here, so that part was kind of nice. So I just did some quick glazing on those fine details, and we got a little bit more work to do on the bases before we're done. So the detail I decided to do was to add some slime effect directly to the bases of these miniatures because these Skaven are supposed to be running around in the sewers. So to create that look, I decided to use Kiwi by Apple Barrel Paint. I applied 2 thin layers directly onto the bases of the miniature in order to create that kind of slimy, kind of oozy kind of look on the bases as well. Now, if you notice, a lot of the darker color we actually have for the bases kind of peeks through the kind of bleeds through the base coating that we did with the Kiwi paint, but that's perfectly fine because it just makes it look like it's even more toxic, oozy, and gross, and it actually kind of adds over to the overall look on the bases. And once I do that, of course, the next thing I do, of course, is a quick matte varnish all over the entirety of the miniatures as well, so that way we can have that nice flat acrylic look for the miniatures. The reason why I decided to do that is completely optional. It's because I like a more muted look on my miniatures as well. And then once we're done with that step, the next thing we gotta do, of course, is to rim the bases. So I rimmed the bases with 2 thin layers of Skyline by Folk Art, so that way we get that nice kind of grayish blue color. It's the same color that I actually use for all of the skirmish miniatures in my studio. And the last thing I do, of course, is on the slime and ooze that I do, of course, I just put some high gloss wash directly on top of it. In this case, I use polyacrylic, just clear polyacrylic, high gloss polyacrylic by Midwax to kind of create that oozy kind of slimy appearance that we saw, that high gloss finish on the slime portions of the bases. And as you can see, this is the end result of the miniatures that we actually have. As you can see, we have a beautiful tabletop standard. At the same time, we didn't spend very much money at all in order to achieve this effect. In fact, if you were to buy everything from our cheapskate method for the very first time, you're talking about a grand total cost of $24.83 in order to purchase those materials to paint your miniatures to the exact same quality that we did. And it's actually quite cheap in order to do so. And like I said before, it's assuming that you're purchasing those materials for the first time. Now let's go and talk about the materials that you'll need to purchase from both Army Painter as well as Citadel if you want to achieve the exact same results we did, but using those name brand paints instead. So these are the materials that you need to purchase from both Citadel as well as Army Painter if you want to achieve the exact same results we did, but using those name brand paints instead. You'll need to buy a can of Corax white spray paint, which is going to cost you $17, as well as the colors Haxos Pale Sun, Everland Sunset, Fulgrim Pink, Teclis Blue, Caliban Green, Luganeth Orange, Cyberite Green, Cadian Flesh Tone, Morghast Brown, Baylor Brown, Hellion Green, Moot Green, Slanesh Gray, Eshin Gray, Flayed One Flesh, Mephiston Red, XV88, Rust Gray, as well as Ulthuan Gray, and all those colors cost $4.55 a piece. You also need to buy that pot of Wildwood, as well as Talisar Blue, Leadbelcher, Aethermatic Blue, as well as Retributor Armor, and those cost $7.80 as well. You also need to buy a can of Army Painter Strong Tone, which also costs $32 on top of that. So assuming that you're purchasing all these materials from Citadel as well as Army Painter for the very first time, you're talking about a grand total investment of $174.45 to paint up your miniatures the same way we did, but using the Citadel as well as Army Painter method instead. And when you subtract that from our cheapskate method of $24.83, we end up with a grand total savings of $149.62. So there you guys go. This is how you guys can quickly and cheaply paint up Skittershank's Clawpack to a beautiful tabletop standard while actually saving a lot of money. And because of the current state of the economy and the way inflation is currently going, if you're looking for a way to save money on the miniatures wargaming hobby, may I suggest switching to cheap craft paints and other materials in order to paint up your miniatures. After all, you can achieve a very similar results at a fraction of the price. It could be said only at 10% the price if you think about it on a larger scale. And you can use those money instead to buy miniatures or do whatever you want with that money. Heck, you can save it if you want to. You don't have to spend it all if that's the case. So if you're looking for a way to save some money, may I suggest doing that instead, because that's what I do and I can afford to buy miniatures because of it. And that's the way I pretty much save my money in my own hobby time. So there you guys have it. If you guys have any other questions or comments, please put it down in the description box and the comments box down below. I'd love to hear your guys' feedback on this. And as always, please feel free to check us out on Facebook, Instagram, as well as blogger.com for all the latest greatest hobby news related to this channel. That's going to do it for this episode of Cheap Shots. I will see you guys next one. I am Commander Cheapskate, and keep it classy.